On this episode of China Uncensored, Sierra Leone is the first country in Africa to sidestep a debt trap set by China. Will others follow? Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa more or less the size of South Carolina. In fact, it's kind of what South Carolina sees when it looks in the mirror. But unlike South Carolina, where the average life expectancy is 77 years, people in Sierra Leone live to an average of just 52. Still, that's a lot better than in 1995, when Sierra Leone was in the middle of a bloody 10-year civil war and people barely made it to age 35.
We are running, coming for town. Others were searching for food when they got all of us. When we had that, we left the boats coming for town. We fell into their ambush. They captured us. We had full number, assembled 7 of us, 6 were killed.
Luckily, that's all in the past. Still, to this day, Sierra Leone remains one of the poorest countries in Africa. More than half the population lives below the poverty line of $1.25 a day. But recently, things seem to be looking up for Sierra Leone.
We are a successful model of stable democracy, one that has evolved and matured in 20 years from chaos and lawlessness of civil conflict.
That was the country's new president, Julius Maada, elected in April. Here he is in China at the recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where China's leader Xi Jinping pledged $60 billion of loans to Africa. But President Bio made headlines last week when he overturned a huge deal with China that his predecessor, Ernest Bai Korma, signed a few years back. The plan was for a Chinese company to build the Maada International Airport, with funding from a Chinese state-owned bank to the tune of $312 million. A third of that was to be from a loan that Sierra Leone would have to pay back. Sierra Leone's Minister of Transportation and Aviation announced the project's cancellation in a letter, part of which was published in the Daily Nation, a Kenyan newspaper. So instead of taking out a massive loan to build a brand new airport that it doesn't need, Sierra Leone is going to fix up the one it already has. That seems like a prudent choice, given that a recent IMF mission to Sierra Leone found that the economic environment remains challenging and hailed the new government's efforts to stabilize public debt and reduce it to sustainable levels and prioritize public investment aimed at reducing social and infrastructure gaps. It turns out that an earlier $200 million loan from China for the same proposed new airport was canceled when the IMF and World Bank did a debt sustainability analysis of Sierra Leone and expressed strong concerns about the deal. And when a formal organization like the IMF says it has strong concerns, in normal language, that means run. The risk of taking a loan from China is, let's say, different from taking a loan from the IMF. If you can't afford to pay back an IMF loan, they may impose some conditions before bailing you out with another loan. Those conditions might include making you adopt free market reforms, clamp down on corruption, or strengthen rule of law institutions. But those are generally things that make a country better and can attract future investment. But if you owe money to China and can't afford to pay up, well, they take their pound of flesh, like Djibouti, the African country of Djibouti. China recently set up a military base there, likely through political pressure. China is also helping finance the main seaport in Djibouti, but if they can't pay off its debt, and that seems likely, it may be forced to hand over its port to China. And this means China would control the key access point in and out of Djibouti. The big fear is that as China hands out loans for huge infrastructure projects around the world as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, it will use the loans that countries can't afford to pay back as a way to take resources or territory. But by bucking that trend, Sierra Leone has just become the first African country to sidestep one of China's potential debt traps. Some experts even say that Sierra Leone may be the first of a series of dominoes that are about to fall. A professor at a college in North Carolina says this cancellation is a sign that African countries are starting to wise up when it comes to the threat of Chinese loans. Now, after the Maada airport deal was axed, China was quick to say, "Nothing to see here, folks. I don't think this particular project should be overblown as an indication of problems between the Chinese and Sierra Leone governments," said China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Lu Kang. and then between the lines expressed hope that other African countries wouldn't develop any hang-ups about taking Chinese money. When cooperating with African countries that include Sierra Leone, China has always adhered to the principles of equality-based consultations and win-win cooperation. Of course, when you see headlines like this about Sri Lanka, or this about Zambia, you wonder if the Chinese regime has a slightly different definition of win-win. I think it means if you repay the loan, China wins. If you can't repay the loan, China also wins. Win-win. So what do you think about Sierra Leone canceling its loan from China?
The Sierra Leone cancellation of the 400 million Chinese loan. Now, I know you guys already know the facts, but I'm going to get into them briefly. But what I really want to discuss today is the implications and what this sets a precedent for, not only across Africa, but across the world, and why China is in trouble. Now, what happened is there was a deal that was signed by the former president. His name is Ernest Bai Koroma, and it was basically for an airport that was to be built in the capital of Freetown of Sierra Leone. Now, the IMF and the World Bank had warned Sierra Leone that the project would cause a really super heavy debt burden on the country. But let me just mention. So basically, the IMF actually invested $200 million in upgrading the current airport, which is called the Lungu International Airport. And the problem with this airport that, the former government had said was that it was actually like right next to, so basically it was right next to Freetown, but you had to take a boat or, a ferry to get to the main capital city. And so they said this was affecting tourism, etc., etc. So now all of a sudden, China came and offered the previous president a deal to build a brand new international airport, and it was going to be going to be closer to the capital city, so you wouldn't have to take like a boat or anything, and it was designed basically to replace the old airport. But he had just gotten the old airport upgraded for $200 million with the IMF. So I wonder how much he ate from the Chinese. And apparently this new airport was going to be more accessible, and the Chinese, then they'd gotten themselves in. So the China was going to it was going to be built by the China Railway 7th Group, one of the major groups that's in Africa. Did you know that 10,000 Chinese companies in Africa? It's totally crazy. And it was going to be funded by the Chinese Exim Bank, and it was basically going to be the construction of a new city and a Chinese exclusive economic zone. So they were going to not only create their own little airport, but they were going to create their own little zone where they can bring things in. Well, a month or two before the elections, the former president actually opened this, and it was going to be one of his legacy projects. Shock on China, and shock on him, because he lost the elections, and he lost the elections actually in April. That's Koroma. And so what happened is the decision now was made by the government said that they were going to cancel all vanity projects, because basically that people don't even have food, they don't even have access to healthcare, they don't even have education, and yet they're investing $400 million in an airport. It didn't make sense to the government. So what they did is Aviation Minister Kabine Kalon, he released a statement last week, and he said the project was unnecessary and Sierra Leone would instead continue to renovate the current airport. And he didn't know, he wasn't aware if the cancellation would have any financial implications, but he also stressed that Sierra Leone remained in good terms with China. Now, this is huge. This is absolutely significant, because China has been the single largest bilateral financier of African infrastructure, and what we're seeing is that China, usually there's a lot of corruption involved, allegedly, and there's a lot of signs that a lot of these presidents, prime ministers receive a little handout in order to do these projects. And the infrastructure projects on their own are not a bad thing, but the problem is usually usually they are priced like they're, you know, they're overpriced. So something that costs maybe $400 million is put at 1.2 trillion, you know, so they overprice everything. So, you know, corruption, of course, so that now, but we have to pay the overpriced thing, so we don't usually get value for money. Well, yeah, so the cost of a lot of African projects are inflated by corruption on both sides, and it's a total mess. And you know what, actually construction had already begun earlier this year, but the government has said it was going to cancel the project because it cannot afford to repay China. And this is unprecedented. We just want to give a huge shout out to Sierra Leone. You guys are awesome. And you know what? The current Sierra Leone president was even in China for the Chinese summit, but that didn't affect anything. And you can kind of see his pictures here. They're not as warm, you know, as the former president, because he hadn't been, you know, he hadn't been warmed up yet. But this is unprecedented, and I'll be telling you why right after this. Wake up, Africa! The Europeans are not going to just sit back and let China take over Africa. Now, what has happened is that Zambia defaulted on a couple of loans, and so they lost their power company, Zesco, and that has been taken over by the Chinese. Their major national electricity company is now being run by China. Now, if that isn't even worse, they've also lost, a few months ago, they lost their Zambia Broadcasting Corporation. It's called the ZNBC. I think it's the Zambia National Broadcasting Corporation, which is now fully owned by China. And, you know, the government has been denying that this is the case. They've been trying to play cute. They've been trying to play, you know, like everything is okay. But they have actually been in secret talks over how their national electricity company would be taken over. This is crazy. Do you think an African country would be allowed to run China's national electricity company? And, you know, it just shows you that China's neo-colonial strategy is reaching ahead. I mean, it's reaching its climax. They've been doing this covert business for so long. And now, you know, they've got their tentacles so deep inside. They've got their tentacles so deep inside that it's going to be hard for some countries to turn back. Now, what's happened is, you know, their whole strategy is they encourage indebtedness. So, hey, they come with the money. They come with the money. They give you, they give you, they give you. Then they, once you default, they start to take over strategic assets because of failure of repayment. And you see, what China has done is they have studied countries that are corrupt. They have studied countries that, you know, that are greedy, that have greedy leaders, which is most African nations. And that's why we find most African nations are in this situation. And then they kind of have this, their long-term outcome is the effective ownership of commanding heights of the economy. Remember, I did that thing on the Seven Mountains prophecy, health, economy, etc., you know, media, entertainment. So they come in, they give you a deal you can't refuse. They pour that money on you. They pour that money on you. They pour that money on you. And then all of a sudden, they come collecting, and they're very vicious when they start collecting. And you know what? Even the Chinese government, they know they actually have a problem in Zambia and other nations. But you know what they said? They were just like, us, we're protecting the Chinese. If your people cannot negotiate for you, if Zambians cannot look, if the Zambian government and the Zambian politicians cannot look after the interests of Zambia, that's not our fault. So a lot of contracts have been signed in secret. It's a problem. We don't know what our governments have done, and that's why I am telling you, in the next few years, because, you know, the next election for Zambia is, I think, 2020, somewhere there, you're going to see a lot of African governments toppling. A lot of African governments toppling because they have sold our souls to the devil, literally. Just check out how, you know, Zambia, by the way, Zambia has been allowing Chinese immigrants to come in since 1964. And now, after all this happened, the Chinese have even taken a road, one of the main roads that's even on the national map of Zambia. Check out this video. It's crazy. We'll be right back. Wake up, Africa!
Okay, we are by Ali Kinkata Road. Just near the mass media. Now, you can come and see here. It's our Chinese friends. Now, this road has been there since independence. So you are telling us that this road that has been there, it is there on the map of Zambia. Huh? The Chinese will come today and you put your more and cross the road. Now, look, the road is crossed. But I think there's something wrong with our government. There is something drastically wrong. And if we Zambians are not waking up, tomorrow we will find ourselves foreigners. How do you close Alikinkata Road? You are telling me that all these years, this was a wrong road. And the president doesn't stay far from here. You close the road. Do we have a president in this country? Is the president there for us? That the Chinese now can do whatever they want. Now look at what is being developed here. So if the Chinese can be closing roads, this is a problem. I don't understand what the Chinese have given us. They have bewitched us. The Chinese have bewitched, including all the government officials, that they can do what they like. And this must be stopped. There's just no way you can do this kind of thing.
Africa Watch on the Dr. Mumbi Show. My name is Dr. Mumbi Saraki. How you guys doing? Absolutely amazing news coming out of Sierra Leone last week. And you know what? Kenyans were, not even just Kenyans, Africans were celebrating. Guys were happy. You know, guys were tweeting about it. You know, a lot of people tweeting their presidents like, yo, look what happened. Look what happened in Sierra Leone. Can you do the same in Uganda? Can you do the same in Kenya? Can you do the same in Nigeria? It was absolutely awesome. But of course, one thing the aviation minister, Kabine Kalon, said is they weren't sure if there would be financial implications, because what China has done is they have made it more costly for you to cancel a deal than to actually follow through on it. And a lot of Kenyans reached out to me through Twitter, and they were like, you know, we're in too deep. We can't back out, because when you back out, it almost costs as much, or actually even more, than just completing the project and dealing with the consequences. But now what this says and what this shows is that, you know, China has a problem, because there's a lot of elections that are coming up across the African continent. Later on this year, we have one in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We just had one in Cameroon. 2019, we're going to have an election in Nigeria and other countries across Africa. There's also an election coming up in a year or two in South Africa. There's also an election coming up in maybe 2 years in Zambia. So this is worrying, because what we're seeing is a lot of these new, a lot of the new presidents that are coming in are actually winning their elections on these anti-China sentiments and on talking about how they will liberate their nations from China. And what we're going to see is, as much as China has these deals, things can be changed politically. And that's what we actually saw happening in Malaysia, because, you know, the previous Malaysian government had signed all these deals with China. They were going to lose all this stuff, and China was like, but your legislation says A, B, C, D. So you know what they did? Malaysia had to change the legislation. You know, had all these parliamentary bills and everything, changed the legislation, and then came out like, sorry, you know. I love it. And so, you know, as much as, but what we're seeing is that China is getting more and more of their fingers into not just the media and trying to control the narrative in different nations, particularly in Namibia. Actually, in Namibia, they were told, hey, they tried to direct at you what the president should say, something positive about Beijing, and they were told, where? Stop it. And so now we're going to see a huge shift, because, you know, now that Sierra Leone has stood up and done that, it is going to give other African nations the confidence to stand up and do the same. And we already saw it also happening. You know, as I mentioned, Malaysia cancelled a 22 billion China-backed project in August, and it was huge, because they just said, we can't afford to pay you back, we can't afford these terms. So this is just gonna be, you know, This is going to be absolutely amazing because it shows us that there's a way out, there's a loophole, and the loophole is in changing governments, is in electing more patriotic leaders and leaders who have the kahunas